We're here today with Kristy Friedrichs. She is the COO at New Relic. Welcome, Kristy. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Neeta. It's so fun to be here. I've really enjoyed listening to your podcast, and I'm happy to be featured on it.
Thank you. I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about how you got to New Relic and a little bit about your journey and what was surprising, because you've had such an interesting background.
It's an unusual resume for sure, an unusual journey. I think the common thread throughout is, number one, taking on new challenges before I felt ready for them. And in fact, oftentimes that's paired with the most surprising element, which is that I was able to be successful despite a sort of lack of expertise, traditional expertise in some of these areas. So taking on new opportunities and then using a lot of sort of first principles thinking to figure out how to be successful. Because when you don't have the benefit, for example, of growing up in an HR world, and then you suddenly find yourself as chief people officer of a tech company, you really have to figure out what's the most important thing here. How am I going to be uniquely able to meet the challenge of this role? And what expertise do I need to build around me, given that expertise is still valuable and I don't necessarily have it? But I guess just backing up a little, my career was, I spent the first 16 years of my career at Bain Company consulting. I was on the client-facing side for the first probably 14 or so years up through associate partner. And what I always gravitated towards in those situations, I really enjoyed the process of being brought in by a client who had a tough problem that needed help figuring it out. And that was always interesting. But what was always most interesting to me was how you actually get it done. So once you have the answer, the idea, okay, then how do you actually put it into practice? And for that, it's all about understanding an organization, understanding what makes it tick, how things get done, who needs to be bought in, who has the best ideas, all that kind of thing. And my last 2 years at Bain, I was in an operating role where I was running operations for the Bay Area business, a lot of sort of staffing, leadership development, performance management, a lot of capacity management and things like that, which translated reasonably well into my chief people officer role, but not perfectly, because I wasn't running a line HR function. And a consulting company has a very different set of employee needs and challenges, set of recruiting targets than a software company. So I was chief people officer at New Relic for about 4 years. And then my last 2 years at New Relic, I was chief operating officer, which means a lot of different things. But at New Relic, it was designed as a way to help run the company internally. So it was a very internal-facing COO role. It was, what's our operating rhythm? What data do we bring to bear? How do we make decisions? Who is accountable for what? And how do we maintain that rhythm and tracking to make sure that we're hitting our targets?
One of the things I really love about your career is that you're always ready for a challenge. I am curious to know, what was maybe one of the bigger challenges you had to work through, and how did you get there?
I appreciate the confidence in me. I will say I don't always feel ready for the challenges, right? And I think that's part of the secret that I think is getting explored more and more often these days is actually you look to leaders and you think, wow, they've got their act together. I could never do that. And meanwhile, the leaders are sitting there thinking, I do not have my act together. What am I doing? And you just manage through. But I guess all that aside, one of the things that felt almost insurmountable at the time it happened and surprising was I was chief people officer when COVID hit. And we're fortunate in a lot of ways because we're a software company. We didn't have a manufacturing line. We didn't have people who needed to be in the office, but we did have security challenge. We had load balancing on our VPN. And we had a lot of mental health challenges with parents having small children at home and things like that. And people who didn't have small children at home feeling like they just couldn't separate work from life and were working constantly. And so how did we shift our operations from largely in person, with the exception of our field sales teams, but even then in person with customers, to largely remote in a matter of days? And I think the way I approached that challenge was, I think the way I approach a lot of challenges was to just, okay, what do we know? What do we know how to do? What are the biggest problems to tackle? What's going to get in the way? And then a lot of empathy and listening, right? Because I think our attorneys and HR teams and IT teams met in preparation for work from home and thought about VPN load balancing and work from home remote setups and things like that. But we weren't prepared for things like, hey, my kids are out of school. Can you create an online school for my children? We weren't prepared for things like, I live in a house with 4 people I don't know that well, and I can't leave my bedroom. I'm starting to get depressed. Like, we weren't ready for all that stuff. And so you couldn't just come up with a plan, announce it, and then just assume everything's fine. You have to have a regular set of outbound communication and a regular set of inbound listening and understanding challenges. And you also have to be pretty clear on some decisions that may not be popular, right? So the school example was like, I have a lot of empathy. I had small children at home too, but there's no way a private company can replace a public school system. And so you just have to work around it and figure out what are some accommodations we can make and what are other accommodations we just can't make as we work through it. One thing I did, just as a small example, was I wrote an email at the end of that first week. We shifted to work from home on a Thursday, and on Friday I sent an email saying, hey, here's what you can expect. Here's how we're doing. And I shared a little personal anecdote about my kids. And then I did it again. People said, hey, the next week, there's more stuff coming. There's more benefits. Can you do it again? So I did it the next Friday and then the next Friday. And then I actually did it for about 6-7 months. Every Friday, I would send an email. Just sometimes it was like, hey, here's an announcement about some benefits. Sometimes it was a personal story. A lot of times it was stories from other employees that they had sent me. And years later, people were telling me that they looked forward to that email every Friday afternoon because it helped them feel connected to the company. And at the time, I knew people were reading it, but I didn't really. And it's stuck with me as just an example of the importance of connection, communication, and empathy in anything you're driving. And you could feel like a broken record or you're throwing a lot of information out into the wind, but people appreciate that. Oh, and one more thing. One more thing is nobody knew what they were doing. And I built a community. I had fortunately built a community of other HR leaders at similar sized SaaS companies. And we just liked each other. And in COVID, we started meeting daily, and then it went to twice a week, and then it went to weekly. But we got each other through it because we were all experiencing the same thing. And I think for any leader, I would recommend trying to find that community because you can do a lot with your peers and your community at work, but there's a set of people who are going through similar things that you're going through that can be really valuable.
I think there's some really excellent learnings there. And I absolutely think that during COVID, to have that level of reassurance and connection had to be really powerful for your colleagues. I'm sure there's a lot of appreciation for that. Driving change in an organization is one of the hardest things to do or live through. You have had a lot of success with this. Why do you think it worked?
It is never easy, and nobody ever gets that good at it, I think is the reality. It's the business model transformation we undertook at New Relic over the last 3 years. So New Relic historically had an application performance monitoring product, innovated the market of cloud-based APM in 2007. Over the subsequent years through the IPO, kept adding adjacent businesses and products like logging and infrastructure monitoring and browser and mobile monitoring, and sold those as their own SKUs with different pricing meters. And you could buy those or not buy those depending on what you wanted. So we made 2 shifts in order to address some challenges we were facing as well as where the market was heading. The first thing we did is we replatformed the product. So we said, look, observability requires that you see everything across the suite. It does not make sense for you to shut down and say, I only want to look at the application. I don't want to see what's happening on the front end. Or I don't care about the logs that the application is throwing off because I only want to see what the APM is showing about the time it's taking to do certain things. And so for one price, you access the whole platform. So that was change number 1. And that was a change in pricing meter, right? So you were used to paying per host, you were used to paying per GB for logs, and we changed it to a seat-based model with additional cost plus pricing for the data that you ingested. And so that required a big overhaul of all our contracts. The second thing we did was we switched to a consumption-based pricing model. So we moved to where historically we had been a subscription business where you make a commitment, you pay for the commitment, you have a certain amount of capacity. If you go over, we have to go for a true up, or renegotiate a payment, and things like that. It's not automatic. And it led to a bunch of adverse behavior as well as a whole bunch of unpaid usage. So we shifted to a consumption-based model, which required, it didn't really matter what you committed to. There was some benefits to making bigger commitments, but we charged based on what you actually used. And we were public at the time. It was trying to do a triple backflip, like the most complicated gymnastics move ever done. And none of us knew how to do it or how successful it was going to be. And I think the reason, it was tricky. We had some learnings. I wouldn't say it was like totally smooth sailing, but I think that the couple things that I learned from that are basically first principles thinking applies to every change, right? What are the key metrics we're trying to drive? Who owns them? What do they need to do differently in order to drive these metrics versus the other metrics? How can you track and get to leading indicators to making sure it's working, even if there's some lagging indicators like revenue that'll come out later? And then getting those behaviors clear, because it takes the whole team getting on board and just grinding it out, right? I talked about deals like we had 15,000 paying customers. Every single one of them had to shift from the old model to the new model. And some of that was done automatically. Most of it was done with sales teams and the deals desk working through and grinding out every single deal, coming up with customer specific issues and adjustments and transition planning and things like that. So if you get the key metrics wrong, if you get the behaviors wrong, if you don't think through some of these longer term things, it's going to get lost once you go down to that deal level and that actual customer level.
What I really hear in that too is that it sounds like you struck the balance between the short and long term in that. And I'm also hearing something that I don't often hear in change management, which is it's not just internal, but it's change for your customers too. And so being mindful of that end to end is like how you actually get there. What are some of the misconceptions maybe around transformation? And this maybe refers more back to your work at Bain because you did have that wider perspective on this.
And yes, I made all the mistakes that you always make in transformations. It's so much harder as an operator to get everything right, even if you know intellectually what the right thing is to do. And I think the number one thing is you always miss out on communication. I think it's either hubris because you understand it. So of course your employees, of course your customers should understand it. Of course it's obvious why this is the best thing. And I'll explain like on the customer side, just as an example, shifting to a consumption model, shifting to platform-based pricing. Some customers said, I only want APM. You're trying to gouge me on the pricing by selling me all this stuff I don't need. And then you get down to it and you're talking to customers and you're sharing, look, you're flying blind on half your environment, right? And here's all the downside of flying blind. And here's what your developers are saying about flying blind, number one. Number two, here's why the cost is actually not higher. And here's how we've baked it in to make sure we're not like tripling your bill for the same thing. We're actually creating more value for the same price. But that takes every single time, every single conversation. And guess what? The execs can't have that conversation with 15,000 customers. So it starts with your employees really understanding and buying into the change and why you're doing it. And cynical employees will say, oh, it's because New Relic wants to charge more for the same thing. It's because we're trying to sneak in a price increase, not because this is the way the market is heading. This is the way the shift has been away from these siloed products to the platform-based programs. And if employees don't buy in, customers are definitely not going to buy in. So anyway, so I mentioned hubris. You understand it. It seems so simple. Why can't they understand it? There's also a little bit of humility, which is, I don't want to hear myself talk. I've said this thing before. I'm boring. I don't want to repeat myself. And so you feel like a broken record. And I guess every time I would have a conversation where I'd mention something that I felt was straightforward that we had talked about 6 months prior, and an employee would ask a question about it, I'd realize when you're actually like day to day writing the code or structuring the deal or closing the books, you're not thinking about this stuff all the time. And it's so important to just maintain those couple messages, the clarity and consistency, and just keep saying them.
Yeah, that relentless focus, certainly. How long did it take for New Relic to really move through this change?
The way we measured the transition was basically when did we launch it to when was our sort of last customer brought on board. We had gotten through probably 80% of it in the first 12 months. So we had transitioned most of our customers, but there was the long tail of multi-year deals. And oftentimes they were our largest customers. So it actually wasn't all done for about 2 years. And there's still legacy stuff to work through. But after 2 years, we were pretty well through the bulk of the transition.
One of the big things that you did, which is a really seminal moment in any company that was founder-led, is moving from a founder to a professional CEO. And there can be a lot of emotion and also opportunity. So I think for employees, I think there's some exciting moments in there, but maybe some angst too. What were your takeaways from your experience with this at New Relic?
Great question. I think number one, even if you have a CEO who is just successful at every turn and wants to stay for years and years, you always need a succession plan, right? And I think if you find you don't have a viable successor, you've got to start hiring for it, even if you're not ready. And in fact, always in advance of when you're ready for it, because you never know what the future holds. And the absolute worst case scenario is you train an amazing executive and they go on to be a CEO somewhere else, right? That's actually a great outcome. I think we were fortunate in New Relic in that we didn't have a lot of ego in the C-suite. And so the ability to hire successors, develop successors was something we could be super open about, and we didn't have to worry about politics and things like that, that I think sometimes creep in when you're talking about potential successors, either with folks vying for that new role or with the CEO who doesn't want to think about moving on. So plan in advance, always have a succession plan. Even when Bill Staples took over for Lucerni as CEO, we needed to go with a succession plan for Bill to the board, right? And it was, we don't have a well-developed one because we just did it, but that's the right time to start thinking about it as always. So I think there's that. And then there's just the reality of an internal successor is always easier, but to do your fiduciary duty, you have to do an internal and external search. And I think what you want to make sure is that you're super clear on what you need in your next CEO, because what you need is different from what you have now, right? You're going to be in a different stage with different requirements. And the more you can set up those tests at the company level for your internal successors, the better. So giving opportunity, for example, P&L responsibility for a functional leader, or for forays into different functions for someone who may not be as adept on the go-to-market side, for example, or adept on the product or R&D side. You really want to make sure you're testing that individual's ability to understand across different function areas. And then the third is just making sure the rest of the team is locked in place, bought in, because, for example, New Relic's a deeply technical company. It was really important that our successor CEO had a technical background. You don't often find someone with a technical background who also has deep financial and operational experience. So staffing around that by having retention plans in place, for example, for the CFO. I moved into the COO role to help with cross-functional alignment and internal operations. Having done a lot of that as chief people officer, it was a natural move. And so it's building that team around the new CEO to make sure that you're setting them up for success.
So whether it is the new CEO or to business unit leaders, how do you think that execs can better partner with human resources?
It is a great question, and it's an ongoing challenge. And I think the onus is on both and we could call it HR, that's fine, the HR teams as well as the functional and product-led teams. So it's not just on one side or the other. I think a really well-run HR function actually partners super closely with finance, by the way. So I'd say HR and finance as a unit can help you make better decisions. So if you think about when you're scaling, it's a temptation to just be like, for example, every account executive equals 1 million in net new bookings. We have a $20 million target. We need 20 new account executives without thinking about, okay, what are the right management ratios and layers we need in place? What are the right kinds of profiles we're looking for to make sure those individuals can be successful? Do we have the right onboarding and training plan in place? Are we paying the right amount for each person? And so I think that's why I say HR and finance together, because it's, especially at software companies, it's the biggest expense. And people don't often think about it. At least they didn't used to. I think they're getting there more and more, but it's a big shift in terms of an expense and an investment, right? And so how do you partner with HR? You make sure that you have job roles and expectations that are clear. It's not, you're not hiring an account executive. You are hiring for $1 million in new sales, right? You're not hiring a finance person. You're hiring someone to create a new planning process. And so you want to think about the outcomes. You want to think about an org structure that makes sense and is cost effective and efficient, right? I would say I've seen organizations that hire well ahead of growth in the leadership. So you end up with spans of control that are really narrow in sales functions, for example, where it's like a VP would have 3 direct reports or something like that. And it's just maybe if you continue on that hiring trajectory, and maybe you want to hire out in advance of that, but you have to be clear and then you have to be accountable against it and continue to build it out. So that's on scaling, right? And I think scaling is hard because you're desperate to make hires, because when you're scaling and growing, everyone's hair's on fire and you just need help. And so you're just extending offers and doing what you can to close them. And you don't ever step back and say, okay, like, now how does this look for internal equity, or how does this look for our overall structure and efficiency? And I think you need to do that on a more frequent basis when you're scaling, then feels natural.
What about when you're talking about driving change? What's the difference there, do you think?
I think the biggest difference there is they're harder decisions, right? Because when you're driving change, you may need the same number of people. You need them to be doing different stuff, right? So you need to be super clear on what those expectations are. HR can't do it on their own, but the teams can't do it on their own either, right? They need to partner together, and HR can bring that expertise in terms of asking the right questions and bringing the right structure to say, this is what you actually need from this role now, as opposed to what you needed in the old model. And then I also think some managers are really quick to say, we need all new people. And some managers are really quick to say, we need no new people, we just need to retrain. And the reality is you need the right people engaged in the right stuff. And some of them will be existing people. If you think about, you either need someone who knows your business inside and out, but needs to come up with new habits, or someone who brings those habits, but needs to learn your business. So either way, you're learning something. And I've found in general, a blend of new folks and existing folks who are bought into the change is the right model. But if you're a manager and you've got your team, or if you're a functional leader and you've only got your function, you don't have that breadth of vision to understand what is the right mix. And I think HR can really partner effectively with you to help.
That leads me into leadership dynamics, because that is such a huge issue in every company. What does it take to maintain healthy dynamics or to foster them if you're coming out of a situation where maybe things weren't working well and you have the ambition to make them better?
It starts with the CEO, because politics and that sort of clique of influence, you can either nurture that, hopefully accidentally, hopefully you're not doing it on purpose, but you could signal that is how you make decisions, or you can lock it down. And I think a CEO bringing their team together, making sure there's no sort of favoritism, there's no, this person speaks and I pay more attention than that person. It's a lot of those softer interpersonal dynamics. I think the chief people officer can play a really important role in pointing that out and holding the CEO accountable, because they don't have a horse in the race of who gets funded marketing or sales, or which product gets more engineering resources, right? And so they can just provide that sort of clarity and transparency. So I think the CEO really listening, engaging, and being open to their full team is really important. Transparency is another one. And I think that's one that organizations, especially when you get to a certain scale, and especially when you're remote, can underestimate the importance of that. You've really got to be clear when decisions get made at the leadership level that there's buy-in and alignment. At New Relic, we use the DAISY model for decision making. It's who needs to be consulted, who approves the decision, who needs to be informed, and documenting it. And then making sure, even if you disagree, that you understand the rationale and you're committed to the decision, right? It's that. And when that doesn't work, we had a shorthand of saying, hey, are we agreeing and undermining? If you hear about a decision and you're annoyed by it in the moment and you go along to get along, but then you don't actually do what's required to help implement it, or you don't push it with your people and things like that, and that's super toxic as well. And I think adhering to the decision best practices, adhering to that transparency and communication is an important way of rooting that out.
And all of this trickles into, or is a fire hose potentially, for culture. How do you define culture?
It's the set of unwritten rules. It's the connective tissue. It's how decisions are made, how you treat each other, how you treat your customers, how you communicate, the sort of norms of how you act and behave. And a lot of companies try to write that down. So it's unwritten rules. They try to write it in terms of a mission and vision, in terms of operating principles or values. And I think that's a super important thing to do, but you have to do it with integrity, right? So if it ends up just being words on a wall, if it ends up, worst case, you write down something that is not true, but it's aspirational, and you don't actually behave in that way, then it really undermines the whole exercise of writing down your operating principles. And so that's one thing leaders can do, is just be honest about what the culture is and what they care about and write it down. But that's what it is. And I think you step into an organization and you can read about the culture, you can hear about the culture, but until you're living it, you don't really know what it is.
My sense is that oftentimes it's what we don't write down and what people experience that's the real marker of culture. I'm not sure that organizations necessarily think about it that way. Do you think repairing a culture is possible if things haven't gone well, or there have been historic challenges, or even something unexpected and traumatic like going through COVID?
Absolutely. I definitely do. I think changing a culture takes a lot of work, but it is possible. And it takes commitment, dedication, and consistency from the top down. You cannot slip up for a second. If you say, we're going to be a culture of accountability, we're going to be a culture where metrics matter and we hold people to metrics, then in every single situation, the The CEO has to hold their direct reports, have to hold their direct reports and each other accountable in visible ways, in small and large, right? And so it's possible. I think you asked about repairing though, and I think that's a lot harder if there has been trust broken, because it's like the old saying, trust takes a long time to build and can destroy it with the stroke of a pen. And I think repairing or changing anything just around culture requires a lot of trust. And I think there are ways of rebuilding trust, right? And it depends what's happened to cause that breach. I think a lot of companies right now are going through layoffs and restructurings. And I think that is a huge breach of trust with employees who feel now unsafe or insecure in their positions. And I think papering over it, assuming everyone feels fine 3 weeks after the announcement, all of those things are ways of just continuing to damage that trust. And then there's ways of rebuilding it, right? There's ways of getting through it stronger, but you have to be open. You have to acknowledge the impact that it's had. You have to ask folks for their opinion, answer questions that might be uncomfortable, all that kind of thing. When it comes to something deeper than that, when you think about CEO malfeasance or sexual harassment, like all of those things are very big breaches of trust, and they just require bigger, bolder moves of accountability in order to move past them. Otherwise, I think there's just permanent breaches of trust.
Is there anything else that you think organizations can do to build trust or to foster it so that you're not in a place where you're having to go through this like deeper repair?
It's a great question. I personally believe in and always have that one of the most underappreciated business skills is empathy. A lot of people talk about hard skills, horsepower, and decision-making and communication, and those are all really important. But I think leading with empathy is the only way to build trust. I need to show that not only do I care about what you're going through, I understand it. And you hear about people saying, I don't feel heard. That used to frustrate me because feeling heard doesn't necessarily mean that whatever you're saying, we subscribe to and what we as the leadership team of the company subscribe to and are going to do. But it does mean you have to say, hey, I understand that you feel this way. I've heard what you've said. I acknowledge your question, all that kind of stuff. But I think having a strong culture requires empathy. Now, that doesn't mean no tough decisions, no performance management, no accountability. And in fact, it's the opposite. Empathy for a team requires that you're committed to high performance of that team, right? And it could mean that you have to part ways with an employee who's not making the grade. And that needs to be okay, but it has to all be done with demonstration that you are a human and you understand what the other humans in your organization are going through.
A lot of companies are in serious pain right now. Obviously, it's feeling like it's still either this non-recession or it's taken us longer to come out of COVID than any of us had hoped for. From your perspective, what do you think companies can do that maybe they haven't necessarily considered, whether it's driving change or some of the hard work, again, that you've experienced of trying to fix or rethink a business model? Because it seems to me like there are some common themes that might be preventing some organizations from getting where they want to go, which again is a challenge for all of us as individuals and organizations. What do you think?
Nothing beats going back to basics and thinking about what are your customers' pain points and which of those pain points do you solve better than anyone else and why? And then you think, what value are you creating by relieving those pain points, and how do you capture that value most efficiently without gouging your customer or leaving value on the table? And then the harder thing is, what are some of the things you're doing that are getting in the way of driving that value? What are the pet projects that are not turning out well? What are the complicated set of management priorities that can't all be executed at the same time? And so how do you, once you've gone back to basics and you've articulated clearly what the value is that you're looking to bring, then you really have to look closely at all the things you're doing that are not necessarily driving that value. And then what's preventing companies from doing that? Partly because it's hard, right? It's hard to think about what you're doing that's differentiated and why. There's a lot of navel gazing around. Ours is the absolute best XYZ. And yet there's another competitor out there who's outselling you. Why is that? Just really understanding that deeply. There's also short and long term, right? There's hanging on to things with potentially questionable future payoff because you believe in them. And so there's just tough calls that you could either delay or otherwise sweep under the rug because you don't have to make that hard choice now. So you just let everything fester and keep going. And then I think what's unique about this current time is that Everyone woke up 4 or 6 quarters ago and said, oh, profitability actually matters. And you can no longer just keep throwing money at a problem. But companies, especially companies that have grown up during the heyday of the last 10 years of just unlimited expansion, 15 years of unlimited expansion, didn't know how to do that, right? And so there's it's never easy to cut costs, but there's quote unquote easy ways, 10% across the board cuts, or hey, let's not cut marketing headcount, let's just cut all the program spend because there's not people, right? And you can do that in a way that's basically like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Because you're not being strategic or thoughtful about what is the actual structure you need to go attack your core business and the things that are adding value to your customers, and you end up spreading the pain. And then even more toxically, not stopping anything, but reducing investment by a little bit across the board. So it's just a little bit harder. Already it was hard to do all the priorities that you're trying to achieve, and then you're making it a little bit harder, as opposed to relieving some of the pressure by making the tough choices.
Would you say then that it's better to take the strategic swing, figure out the business model? You're obviously saying ask the hard questions, do the tough work. Is that how you would think about it?
Yeah, I think so. And I wouldn't say we at New Relic, or even at Bain, when I look about Bain's business, or it's always easier to advise than do, I would say, at stopping things. Stopping things is hard, especially because nothing ever gets put on a list to do that's a bad idea. You just have to use good decision-making hygiene, alignment around a strategy to make those calls. And I think understanding what is putting sand in the gears and making things hard and pulling that as quickly as possible is super important. And I guess it's different every time, right? It could be a set of IT systems. So one example at New Relic that was very personal to me is that when we moved to the consumption model and the platform pricing, we didn't have the data systems in place to let product managers know exactly what dollars were being spent on their product. They could see how much usage was happening in their product, but we had a big free tier, and it was unclear where the dollars were coming from and what our big customers were using. And so we invested behind a new data team to create a new data warehouse and centralized data model to be able to make those decisions. And that was a huge investment. It was much harder than we even realized and things like that. But that's the type of thing that you have to invest behind. You can't do it halfway, because otherwise you can't optimize the outcomes. But then there's other things that maybe sound great, like new IT systems or things like that. Really, it can be very frustrating to not have, but you can hack together without, and you can't distract your IT team who's working on the data stuff with a whole big new project to make a business process easier to do, for example. So that's the type of example of, hey, there's like a list of 12 things. We really have to get them all done, but you can only do 3. And you have to be really ruthless about how you prioritize that as a leader.
Prioritization is hard for everyone. I know I struggle with it too. I like to do all the things, which I think is a common challenge.
You can think about it as, it seems like in the list of 12 things, there should be 8 bad ideas, just do the 4 good ones. But no, it's 12 good ideas. And it's 12 good ideas often who have one person behind it who's really championing it and really wants it. And they're really likable, great employee. And you want to say yes, but it's just, you can't.
What's your top advice for CEOs and senior executives right now?
Number 1 is practice empathy. Understand what your customers are feeling, what your employees are feeling. Communicate that empathy and show that you understand and that you care. And then as a tactical way to do that, practice good decision-making hygiene. Who should be making this decision? Who should be informed? What data needs to be brought to bear to make the decision? And communicate really clearly and over-communicate always.
What do you think high-performance companies do differently from the rest of the pack?
High-performing companies have a high culture of accountability and performance orientation. They're super clear. And it doesn't mean like you can have poorly run companies that are full of top performers, right? I don't want to name any, but I can think of some off the top of my head that just hire absolute stars, but don't have clarity around what those stars are supposed to do, what matters to the company, and how the customers are getting value. And so they languish a little bit, as opposed to, here's our 5-year strategy. Here's our 1-year version of that. Here's what we have to get done this quarter. And here's what your job is and how I'm going to hold you accountable. And then actually hold you accountable, right? Hey, it looks like you missed that metric. Explain it, right? And I think that is super important. It's also, You can do it in a really negative way. Think about GE in the 80s, right? The bottom 10% of people get fired every single year. And then eventually you're just rehiring some of those bottom 10 back because they were actually quite good. So there's way, and then everyone's running scared. And also it creates some toxic incentives around, I've got to make myself look good, which I can either do by performing super well or by making another person look bad, right? And so what you want to do is have a culture where it's clear what the outcomes need to be and you're supporting each other and everyone wants everyone to be successful. And so when it's clear and when there's the right investment behind things and everyone is in it for the company as opposed to in it for their own metrics or their own functions exclusively, that is the sort of virtuous flywheel that keeps performance moving ever upward. And then the other thing I'd say is when you have people who aren't meeting the grade, teams that aren't meeting the grade, products that aren't good fits, you've got to make that decision early and quickly and with empathy and caring and kindness, right? Because if I think about every organization I've been a part of or seen, like there are people who underperform, who get terminated and who part ways with the company, who go on to be extremely successful, right? It's not an indictment on the individual at all, but it is an indictment on that position, that role, and that time. And it's unkind and unfair to the people who are high performing to keep folks or teams or products on board that are not performing. So making those decisions quickly.
Thank you so much, Kristy.
This was awesome. Thank you, Neeta. Really love your podcast and appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thanks for joining us here at Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review or follow the show. It really helps other listeners find us. You can also find full videos and highlights on our YouTube channel.